Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first event with the Kona Youth Initiative. My name is Vaishakhi, and I will be the person hosting the session today. So I first wanted to start with introducing the Kona Youth Initiative. It's an initiative focused on building a space for the youth of North America to help college and high school students have a place to turn to when they have questions or they face Hindophobic events. We also want to eventually plan to have a larger Hindu professionals network for young professionals such as myself, where we can communicate with each other and build a network of our own among our dharmic peers. But most importantly, we are hoping to use this youth initiative to build a community, a safe community for Hindu youth, where you can talk to each other and talk to each other about your dharma, about any questions you have about it, about your practices for different festivals, your henna chops, or questions on where to buy different ethnic clothes. So that is what the Youth Initiative is. And this is, as I said, our first event with the Kona Youth Initiative. And we hope to have many more. And as our first guest, as our first speaker, I am happy to introduce Vishal Ganeshan. He is the curator of the Hindoo History Twitter feed. And you can also find him at VJG Tweets. The Hindu History Twitter feed is a Twitter account that chronicles newspaper clippings, mostly from the late 1800s, early 1900s. So somewhere early in the history of the US, not early in the history of the US, but early in the last century. And he talks about and he's also on Substack, but we'll come to that. Where they talk about Hindu or the conception of Hindu in America back then. In his tweets, he covers everything from the panic that people in Chicago and San Francisco were converging to Hinduism in droves, and how that panic was expressed in these different news articles and by exoticizing the Hindus, or Hindus as they kept calling them. And also, this idea that Hindus were going to take over California with unchecked immigration, or, how to deal with your Hindu servants. So he covers all of these different topics in his Twitter feed, which is great, and you should all absolutely check it out. So without further ado, welcome, Vishal. Let's get started.
Thank you for having me.
Yep, yeah, I'm glad we could do this. So I'm going to start with the question that I'm sure everyone has in their minds. Why Hindu and not Hindu? Why use the bastardized version of the Hindu word, especially given the history around the word Hindu?
Yeah, so this is the most common question I get. Also, yeah, thank you for having me. I didn't know this was the first event for the Youth Initiative, which is, I feel very honored. Also, it makes me feel younger than I am, so that's nice. I don't know if I'm still a youth, but anyways. Yeah, so this is the most common question I get. And I guess the simple answer is just that this is how it's spelled in those days. There's actually like a long a genealogical answer you can give for this. Like if you look at the earliest texts, where you basically had these scholars of comparative religion who started writing about the Hindus, the term they actually used was the Gentus. I'm not really sure of the etymology of that. I think there's some sort of Portuguese derivation of why it was Gentoo. But yeah, it started out with Gentoo, Gentoo, and then eventually that term kind of falls out of fashion and it's replaced by Hindu, Hindoo. And this term Hindu is kind of proliferates in kind of newspapers during this time period, also missionary reports. And it's kind of used as a catch-all term for anyone from India. So it's used interchangeably for Hindus, what we now consider Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and basically anyone from India. But the kind of representation of the Hindu, as kind of you referenced in the introduction, is very much kind of a religious is one based in kind of a religious discourse. So yeah, the Hindu. So I use that term for that reason, because that's the way it was spelled then. But then there's also another reason, which is kind of goes to the methodology of the project. So one of the other very common questions I get is, I post a lot of these newspaper clips that talk about people throwing themselves under the wheels of the Juggernaut truck, or people sacrificing their kids to crocodiles. And a lot of people will respond to me and be like, well, did this actually happen? Is this true? And one of the points I make if you go to my Substack, I have this in the introduction, is that I'm not really interested in kind of talking about or discussing the truth of these claims, because what Hindu history is really about is not like Hinduism per se. It's not about the religion. What it's about is the representation of this religion in the American mind. And one of the books that was kind of instrumental in my developing this project and thinking about it was by this scholar Michael Altman. He's a professor of religion at the University of Alabama, and he wrote this book called Heathen Hindu, and it's about the kind of this topic of the representation of the Hindu during this time period. And one of the kind of methodological points he makes that I think is very smart and something that I kind of took to heart in my own research is that, when we talk about Hinduism in America, from a historical standpoint, we're not really talking about like the religion in America, right? What we're talking about is how Americans conceived of it, how they thought of it, what were the kind of domestic influences that were shaping the information they had access to when they thought about the Hindu. So what he says is this isn't about Hinduism, it's about the conceivability of Hinduism, like how that actually became a category in people's minds. And, in order to kind of understand this, he uses this sort of genealogical research, right? It's like intellectual genealogy. You can think about it almost like an intellectual archaeology, right? Like you had these certain representations and you kind of dig deep into them and try to understand where they came from. The kind of key insight here too is that, I think the traditional story, and if you ask a lot of people today and you were to say like, when does the story of Hinduism in America start? I think most people will say it starts in 1893 when Swami Vivekananda comes to the World Parliament and gives a speech that's like, has a great reception, becomes a very popular figure. But, one of the points that Altman makes, and I think one of the historical realities that the project bears out, is that when Vivekananda gave his speech in 1893, he was operating against the backdrop of like over 100 years of representations of the Hindu that were already proliferating in American society and had already kind of shaped people's perception or view of what the Hindu was. So, it wasn't a blank slate. So I use Hindu with the two O's to kind of make this distinction, which I understand can be a little bit subtle and is easy to get lost in the weeds. But the idea is that the Hindu with the two O's isn't like a Hindu in the sense that we think of it. The Hindu with two O's is a construction or a representation in the American popular imagination that was formed over decades and decades through kind of various different influences. I hope that's clear, but let me know if it's not.
I have to paraphrase what you're saying. So is it something like you're not thinking of actual Hindus, but really this kind of person that the Americans built for themselves in their mind back in those years, based on what they heard from their British counterparts, mostly, I guess.
Yeah, that's basically it, is that this was kind of a representation, an American representation of what the Hindu was. That was, based on various kind of sources of information they had access to. And then, of course, when actual Indians or actual Hindus started coming here in, early 19th century, actually, that's, there weren't that many in those days, but early 20th century anyway. Then, that kind of adds a whole new dimension to this equation, right? Where all of a sudden this representation is tested against people who actually belong to that community. And so that kind of opens up a whole new dimension of this discourse.
Yeah, I think that leads to an interesting question then. And this is something we see happening today as well. How much of a role did Indians or Hindus of the time actually play in perpetuating or dispelling that? Like you said, Swami Vivekananda has often been not accused as much as pointed as the person responsible for kind of putting forward a kind of exotic version of Hinduism to the American audience. So he kind of made it very popular to be Hindu there. So he was responsible for like some of the craze is what I've heard, or rather he's been charged as the person responsible for some of the craze. But what were the other, like, did you come across other Hindus whose voices were actually heard? And what sort of a role did other Indians play, other than just Swami Vivekananda, in either making it worse or trying to help their own people?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of been one of the most interesting parts of the project, is kind of unearthing this whole cast of characters. So yeah, like Vivekananda obviously was the most prominent, and he was, I mean, like it's really interesting to see the newspaper clips about him, and to kind of see how controversial of a figure he became and how beloved of a figure he was, right? I mean, he was like the toast of the town in kind of like upper class socialite New York circles, and he was really like feted by kind of elite Americans in kind of urban centers where he established these Ramakrishna Mission Vedanta societies. It's difficult for us to appreciate now, but the Vedanta societies were really like attracted the cream of the crop of American society. I mean, it was a social phenomena, like all the newspaper clips that you read about the kind of Ramakrishna or the Vedanta Society, whether in Chicago or New York, the kind of recurring concern is that they were attracting like the kind of wealthy aristocratic women of American society, where we're especially attracted to Vedanta Society, and we're going to these lectures, and we're kind of diving into the kind of spiritual teachings of the various Ramakrishna Mission monks who were kind of put in charge of these various societies. So it's I think important to kind of appreciate just how popular this was at the time. But yeah, again, like as you imply, he wasn't the only one, And one of the I wrote a Substack post. So yeah, I'm also on Substack. The Substack's at hinduhistory.substack.com, and that's where I kind of am trying to do more of sometimes failing because I don't have enough time, but it's where I'm trying to do more of the longer kind of research intensive pieces. But I wrote a profile on this lesser known figure named Baba Bharati, a really interesting guy. So he was based in India, in British India. He was actually based in Lahore. He was a journalist, and he actually worked at like a rival newspaper of Kipling. Kipling was also working in Lahore at the time, Rudyard Kipling. And so Baba Bharati was a journalist by training, and he kind of knew Kipling socially, I guess. And he ended up having like a religious spiritual awakening, how you want to call it. He saw like a Krishna Leela basically, and became an ardent Vaishnavite, ardent Krishna Bhakt. And he was given a mission by his guru in Bengal to come to America and spread the gospel. So he came to America. This was in the early 20th century, and he like set up shop in, and unlike Swami Vivekananda, he basically showed up with no plan. Like he just landed in America. There was no speech planned or anything. He didn't have any money, but he ended up being spotted by someone, and they were like, "Oh, who's this interesting guy?" He ended up gathering a following, of people who were just curious about him, wanted to know what he was doing. And so he ended up, writing a book that was called, Kipling was famous for writing this book, Kim, right? It's a novel about a young boy in India. And it's like, a famous book, but also, known as one of the kind of quintessentially Orientalist works about life in India and about Indians. And Baba Bharati, he like in the newspapers, you see that he has like these scathing critiques of the book. And he says, Kipling didn't understand India because he didn't understand the inner life of Indians. And so he actually wrote a book, which I've not been able to find, but it's called Jim. And it's supposed to be like a parody of Kim. Like, I don't even like it's I think it's about like I think it might be about like a young English person in India. I don't know exactly what the premise is, but I know that it's supposed to be like a parody of Kim. So he wrote that, and then he ended up writing a book about Krishna too in America. And the interesting thing about him, though, is that like because he had this journalistic training, and what distinguished him from a lot of these other spiritual figures who came to America is that he would engage in these sort of debates in newspapers. So, at the time, you'd have like missionaries come back from India, and they'd write these like reports in like, one of the famous clips or one of the most extensive ones from Baba Bharati was in the Los Angeles Herald. And there was a column written by this missionary who had returned to India, and it was just like depicting the headline is like depicts horrors of Indian women or something. And the whole column is just about how like badly women are treated in India, and how like child marriage is all over the country. And it's like women are treated like slaves. And again, like, it's important to understand that this is in context of a pretty widespread fear about women turning to Hinduism, right? So this is also kind of a pattern you start to see, is that like, you had a lot of women who were getting drawn towards Vedanta society. And then in response, you see a lot of missionaries start writing about how in India, women were treated very badly, right? The implication being like, what could you possibly see in this spiritual wisdom when you see the fruits of it in India, right? So Baba Bharati, if you go to this issue of the Los Angeles Herald, I quote it in the Substack, is that, he basically writes a response, and he says like, all of this stuff is fabricated. Like Indian women don't feed their kids to crocodiles. Like he basically goes through and he says like all of this stuff is just made up, and he basically says like, look, the missionaries are just lying to you because they want to raise money for their conversion efforts. Like none of this is grounded in truth or grounded in fact. So this is it was really interesting to see this because prior to Vivekananda, prior to Baba Bharati, even in the 19th century, like you do see a lot of ads for Hindu spiritual figures, swamis, who will give the lectures every now and then, and there's like ads for them, and they're kind of like traveling spiritual figures. But Baba Bharati and Vivekananda, Baba Bharati, I think less well known, really I think took it back to missionaries in a way that was interesting and disputed the narrative by writing in newspapers, and his journalistic background obviously was critical for that. But I mean, there was a lot like, Vivekananda, he obviously, when he went back, he established the Vedanta societies, and then all these other figures came out, right? Like to lead the New York mission, San Francisco mission, and all of them were public figures in a way, like they were all kind of influential in their respective times. And, they were regularly, covered in newspapers. And so, yeah, it was definitely, Vivekananda was certainly the most prominent, I would say, but he wasn't the only one. And it's been interesting to be able to unearth the history of all these other figures as well.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating to hear that, we see, for example, later in the 60s, you had all the yoga gurus like BKS Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois, who went in with their yoga knowledge and popularized yoga, and similar fears were like stoked around that time as well. And today you have organizations such as ISKCON, which is also a proper Vaishnavite organization. So it's interesting to see these patterns repeat through history, I think. But like, speaking of the women part, I think it's fascinating that it always comes down to we are scared of the woman, like running, we're losing the women. I think it's interesting to know what were the like negative stereotypes. What were the most common stereotypes that you've seen in all of your work so far? If you had to list like the top 3 or 4, what would be the top 3 or 4 most negative stereotypes or most commonly occurring stereotypes about Indians that you saw in your work?
I don't know if, stereotypes, maybe that's the right word. I think it's just the, to talk specifically about the issue with the women, right? I mean, so the kind of, I think there's a few incidents that are kind of worth highlighting here. So there was a woman, her name was Sarah, I think her name was Sarah Bull. I might be getting her name wrong, but I think it's, Sarah Bull. She was kind of like an heiress, rich, older lady. And she lived in New York. And when she passed away, she actually left her fortune to the Vedanta Society. And her daughter ended up suing her, basically saying that like, she, obviously angry that she lost out on this inheritance. And so she ended up basically suing and saying like, no, like you can't let her leave her fortune to the Vedanta Society. And so there was a whole court case about it. And the question at issue for the judge was basically whether the older lady who had passed away was in a mentally fit state to actually leave her fortune to the Vedanta Society. And it was very interesting because if you look at like the actual like newspaper reports of this court case, what they talk about repeatedly is that like this kind of effect of Hindu spirituality, of Hinduism on the mind was one of like turning you mad. Like basically that it was going to make you like an insane person. And this is also repeated, if you look at, there was an essay called The Heathen Invasion of America. The name of the author is just slipping my mind right now. It's going to bother me. But what's her name? I'll remember it. But it was an essay in Harper's Magazine called The Heathen Invasion of America. And it was very interesting because the whole thing was about like American women are doing yoga, are getting into Hindu spirituality, and it's going to drive them crazy. Like they're going to leave their husbands, they're going to kill themselves, like just like a kind of a list of all the kind of horrors that are going to result, right, because of their introduction to this kind of Hindu spirituality. And then another example was this, received like insane amounts of national coverage. Like I found so many newspaper clips about it. I don't remember the year, but I think it was like 1912 maybe, that there was the president of Purdue University. He was this guy named Winthrop Stone, and his wife was this German lady. I don't remember her name. but she like attended some class at the university about yoga, and ended up leaving her family to like go join an ashram or something. And this was like a national scandal, right? Because like this guy, like, you know, head of a reputed university, like kind of you know, elite of society, and his wife like gets into Hindu spirituality and just leaves and like joins an ashram. And like all the newspaper reports about this were like, this is what happens. Like, we have to protect American women from the scourge, like this Oriental scourge of thank you, Mabel Potter Daggett. That's the author's name. Heathen Invasion of America. I have that. You can look it up on Twitter. You'll find it on my Twitter account. It's really amazing. But yeah, so this is the kind of recurring motif that you see when it comes to like the dangers of American women getting into Hindu spirituality. The flip side of this is, I think, related to your question, the stereotypes, right? Like, because the kind of harm attached to the Swami figures themselves, right? Like, they became, you know, the Hindu Swami became like a manipulative figure who was like capable of these like hypnotic mind control powers that, you know, they were out to like steal American women from their husbands. You know, they were just trying to like, you know, take their money. You know, one of the things I've also has been very interesting to find in the course of my research is the extent to which the Hindu Swami featured as a comic book character. Like, you had a lot of comic strips in newspapers, and you find a lot of comics that feature these Hindu Swamis as characters. And there's like these comic strips where, you know, it's like like an American person looking to like steal money from an old lady. And in order to do so, he like goes into brownface and dresses himself up as a Hindu Swami, and then like purports to tell them their fortune or something like that, and then steals their money that way, you know? So like, this was part of the kind of stereotype of the Hindu Swami and of the Hindu more broadly, is that, you know, they were, they had like, they were capable of like psychological powers that, you know, Americans didn't have, and that they were out to like kind of mind control people and, you know, take them from their families and like take all their money. These are all stereotypes that attach to the Hindu Swami in light of these kind of like fears that, you know, we've discussed about American women succumbing to the charms of the swarthy idol worshiper, as they're called.
Oh, that's interesting. And the more I talk to you, the more I'm convinced that we are living history. Like, I feel like even today, in some quarters, the Hindu Swami is still represented as this questionable figure. So it's so fascinating to hear that we are still living like 100 years ago in some cases. Same stories: protect your women, protect your children, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it has been very interesting to see the kind of like, the kind of resonances of a lot of these themes that you see, for sure.
Yeah. All right, let's change tacks a little bit. And I would love to hear more about, why did you start doing this? Like, this is such a completely random thing to do, I'm sure, from your daily life, actual projects. So why suddenly start to spend time on Twitter, that too, of all places? But like, you know, to look at all these really old articles, what was it that motivated you to do this work?
Yeah, I mean, it was very like haphazard, I think. I mean, I get all the newspaper clips from the Library of Congress Digital Newspaper Archive. It's a free resource, and I don't know how I found it initially, but I found this resource, and I immediately was like, this is awesome. You know, like, it's the newspapers. It has all sorts of newspapers from like late 18th century to like 1960s, and it's just like all digitized, all searchable. Okay. And so I got on the database, and I kind of was just like, when I was like procrastinating, I would just go on there and I'd like look for random stuff. I wasn't searching for anything in particular. And then I was like looking at these old newspapers, and all of a sudden I saw like an ad for a Hindu wizard. I was like, this is very strange. Like, I would not have expected to see, you know, an ad for a Hindu wizard in like a random, you know, early 19th century newspaper. And then, you know, I came across another one. And then I was like, okay, like, there's something here, you know? Mm-hmm. So then I started like doing the specific search terms, and I started finding like, you know, like there was this whole universe of content, like far before, you know, Vivekananda or any of these other guys had actually arrived on American shores. And it was all being, published in these newspapers. So I just started going through and I started searching, and it was like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, there's so much stuff. So I just started going through there, and I started screenshotting articles and interesting things. And I just started posting them on Instagram and Twitter. It's at Hindoo History, by the way, no spaces or anything. But yeah, so and it just like it kind of went from there. So I started collecting all these newspaper clips, and then I started thinking about it more deeply and thinking about like, okay, well, I'm collecting all this stuff. Like, what do I do with it? And that's where this book I was telling you about kind of came in. Like I was just on Google searching, and then I came across Michael Altman's book, the Heathen Hindu. And that was like very valuable for me because it gave me like the intellectual scaffolding that I could kind of fit the newspaper pieces into, right? Like it gave me a kind of framework to think about all the evidence I was finding. And then when I read that and I kind of put two and two together, it just became like, okay, now it makes sense. Like now I kind of understood what I was trying to get at. And I just started posting the clips. And yeah, I mean, it's been a very enlightening project. It's been very interesting, I think, for me so far. I think people seem to like it. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely a wild ride for me when I found your Twitter feed. I was like, this is so fascinating. And you just keep going because it gets wilder and wilder somehow.
Yeah.
The kind of articles and the kind of the way people wrote about Hindus back in the day. But it does sound like you spent some time in... how much time do you think you spend in like looking for your sources versus like as you said, thinking of the intellectual framework around it, right? Like how do you fit the two together when you're like thinking of your next set of posts?
So I would say that yeah, like finding the actual post is pretty easy. I mean, finding the material is pretty easy. Like once you get a hand on like the kind of search, the mechanics of searching on the database, it becomes pretty easy to kind of find what you're looking for and like, do like targeted searches to find the material you want. I mean, again, like there's so much material. So the issue really is like trying to narrow your search in a way that you can actually get what you need. In terms of the intellectual framework, I mean, I should probably, think about that more just because I need to write more of these longer pieces. But I think that, one of the, things that I mentioned in the introductory post on the Substack, and this was kind of informed by Altman's book, is so when you accept this kind of methodology, right, this like genealogical understanding of how the Hindu was conceived of in America, the kind of next question becomes like, okay, well, what are the various like powers and societal influences and interest groups that were contributing to this representation or these various representations? And in my mind, there was basically like three main threads. So the first was actually like a commercial relationship, right? Like, again, like a lesser known fact that people maybe don't appreciate as much is that America and India have had a commercial relationship from like, mid-late 18th century. Like there were merchant ships going from Massachusetts to Calcutta in like the late 18th century. There's actually it was called the East India Marine Society. It's in Salem, Massachusetts. They were like the trade guild that would kind of launch these trade missions. And I think now it's like a museum. I think because they collected all sorts of stuff. And now I think it's like the Peabody Museum. I've never been there, but I know someone who has been there. And they told me that it was funny. Like they were traveling and they're like, I just came across the most random museum in Massachusetts. It has all this like Indian stuff in it. I'm like, that must be the same East India Marine Society. But, this commercial relationship was the first one. And interestingly, it was very cordial, like the American merchants would go to India. They didn't have a trading house. So they basically had to deal directly with Indian merchants. And it was like a very cordial relationship. There's all these accounts we have of them like exchanging gifts, exchanging like portraits. I think American merchants like gave some like prominent trader in Calcutta like a portrait of George Washington or something. Must be there somewhere around there. But so this is how the relationship started. This kind of like just material goods. And then after the establishment of the American Board of Foreign Missionaries, that was like in 1812. That was like when the relationship really changed. Like it added a whole new dimension to this relationship and to the kind of representations. Like during before that, it was people would see these exotic goods, they hear these like tales, and they'd have this idea of India in their mind. But it was when missionaries started going there in larger numbers and writing these missionary reports, that's when this sort of like, what we like the Juggernaut and all this stuff, like the bloody pagan rites. That's really when those come to the fore. And then the third is kind of like the philosophical stream. And this is when we think about like transcendentalism or like the Theosophical Society, even America Vedanta, right? Like this was a very particular kind of reception of information from India that was concentrated among like an elite in New England, like specifically the Unitarian elite. And they really took to like Hindu spirituality and wisdom in a way that informed their own spiritual beliefs. And this was assisted by the Asiatic Society, right? This was founded in 17. I'm going to forget the date. I think it was like 1784. I might be wrong, but this is when the Asiatic Society was formed in Bengal, right? Like this is like William Jones. He was the first Orientalist who found out that there were linguistic ties between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. But the Asiatic Society was very important because they started translating Sanskrit texts. And so like the first version of the Gita came to America in like 1784 or 1785, like right after the establishment of the Asiatic Society. So, like people had access to these texts very early on. And, it's like the kind of philosophical and intellectual stream was very, even though maybe it was not like, didn't have like the mass following that, others did, it was like very influential in its own way. So those are kind of the three broad categories I try to think about when I'm finding articles. And I think like if you if you look through the Twitter, you'll see that like, the bulk of it, I would say, belongs to the second stream. And that's for a very simple reason, which is that America is a very religious country, was a very religious country. Yeah. And there was a lot of missionary activity. And, missionaries would come back from India and they would send their reports through these newspapers, right? And newspapers would publish it extensively. And newspapers at that point, and this is another kind of methodology point, is I think the newspaper is such a wonderful medium for understanding what people at that time thought, because this was the kind of medium of the common man, right? Like newspapers were what reflect what the man on the street was thinking, not like what some academic at Harvard was thinking.
Especially back in that day.
Back in that day, I mean, newspapers were everywhere. Like they published multiple times a day. Like they'd have a morning edition, a noon edition, and an evening edition. Like every city had a newspaper. Like there's just so many of them. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the intellectual framework I think about when I try to find articles. And like I said, it's pretty easy to find like what bucket things fit into once you kind of go on there and start looking at stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if, the fact that a lot of these were printed in newspapers might also explain why the second missionary literature spread a lot more quickly, because at the end of the day, gore sells.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it was definitely, so one of the figures I talk about in Substack is Claudius Buchanan. So Claudius Buchanan was like an Anglican missionary, and he spent most of his life, I think, in India, in Eastern India, like Bengal, Orissa, that area, spreading the gospel. And he was like, he was responsible for the Juggernaut. Like when you think of it, like this is like the kind of defining image of the Hindu for the average American, like for decades. He's responsible for it because he wrote this very vivid report of the Juggernaut Yatra, right? And he was a very vivid writer, very like effective writer. And he also knew exactly how to describe it to his audience. So if you look at his description of the Juggernaut or Juggernaut Yatra, the way he describes it is it's like a scene out of the Old Testament. Like he literally says like this is the seat of Moloch. Like this is like, he describes it as if like it is like this is what they were talking about in the Bible when they talk about like this is the evil that that has to be defeated. And he talks about like the people like sacrificing themselves and people like throwing babies under the wheels, and it's just like it's very like gory, very bloody, very just like again like Old Testament, just like fire and blood. And so you can understand why for an audience that was very steeped into Christian literature and Christian scripture, when they read this, it obviously for them was like, it resonated a lot, right? And they were like, they instantly recognized it as in the way that Buchanan wanted them to recognize it. And it became such a lasting image. I mean, it it almost became like an American idiom, like in one other post, one of the most interesting things I found was that, in the correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, like they referenced the Juggernaut. Like that's how common it was. Like, you have Madison referencing the Juggernaut in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, like, as with the assumption that he knew what he was talking about. Like it was just so widespread that this image of like the Hindu like sacrificing themselves to this like satanic, pagan god, whatever. So yeah, like this stuff was massively popular, and writers like Buchanan, when they started kind of publishing their reports. So the book that he wrote that was very famous and circulated across America is called "The Christian Researches in Asia." It was very popular, and him releasing that book, it led to so many more people doing the same thing, right? Because then it became like, oh wow, like
you can make money out of this.
Well, yeah, because like they were like, these Hindus have to be saved, right? I mean, this is the kind of evangelical mission, was that they saw like all this writing from Buchanan. They were like, well, we have to go there, we have to convert these people, we have to save them. And yeah, of course, there was also financial motives always, right? But it led to a lot, not just other missionaries, but like just curious travelers. It became like almost like a cliche, right? Where like you would have the travel writer who would go to Benares, would go to the Juggernaut and see it for themselves, and they would always be like to go see the famous Juggernaut, that was described by Buchanan or whatever. So yeah, I would for sure that the second stream, historically, the kind of missionary stream has been the most influential, I think, historically speaking. It certainly bears out when you look at the newspaper clippings.
Yep, that makes sense. And I feel like, again, that's one of those things where we see that sort of thread continue today. A lot of more gory descriptions of Hindu practices probably will sell or will spread a lot more quicker. Right. Even though today we might not have something as visceral as the Juggernaut article, I feel like that's still something we see today. So again, you have echoes of the past that we see today.
Well, actually, one good example of this is the if you recall, during the second COVID wave in India, there was like this huge controversy because like all New York Times and Washington Post were basically putting like on their front page like pictures of funeral pyres, right?
Yeah.
And this was really interesting to me because, like, obviously it was hugely controversial. A lot of people in India were saying, like, this is very insensitive. Like, this is like people's families, and you're just like posting pictures of their burning bodies. Other people were like, oh, well, we have to hold the government accountable. But if you look back at, the kind of, and this has been on my list of like Substack posts I've been meaning to write for months now. But the history of how cremation has been discussed in American newspapers is super interesting because in a lot of ways, cremation has always been like considered one of the most barbaric practices of the pagan Hindu, or it's been one of the practices that's been used to kind of draw a strict line between the American and the Hindu, right? Like the Hindus, they do this barbaric practice of burning their dead, and and there's like all these like descriptions of people like, especially in Benares, like people just like the families are often described as like showing no emotion, like not even mourning, just like watching their relatives whatever burn on the pyre. So there was always this very like voyeuristic approach to like Indian funeral practices, and seeing that kind of come to the fore again in the context of the COVID was very interesting because it did show, like in my mind anyway, like this sort of attitude, like these attitudes don't go away, like I think that's one of the lessons I've gotten from Hindu history is that like yeah, societies change, they evolve and they improve, but attitudes, like they don't just disappear, right? Like they are reformed or they change forms or they're kind of are repressed and then they come out again, like and this kind of like visceral aversion to funeral pyres or whatever, which was very prevalent in the newspapers from late 19th century, early 20th century. It's apparently still there. So it's interesting to see.
Yeah, I feel like the Indian love for spectacle, right? Which we absolutely love. I feel all of our festivals, all of our temples and everything are so like, it engages all senses. It's not, I mean, that's something that I feel like it really gets lost in translation when you think about Western context versus Indian context. We really love things being big and loud. Like a normal temple puja on an normal evening puja will be like this big loud affair, whereas most services around here would be like really quiet and simple. And I feel like those sort of differences that leads to like these sort of translation errors that can be misinterpreted and can result in all these sort of takes that are in some cases very insensitive to the other side.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you say that too, because Buchanan, even in his description of the Juggernaut Yatra, like there's obviously a lot of like, I haven't been, but there's a lot of like music and there's a lot of like chanting, and the way he describes it is it's like this was like he felt like he was in hell, like it was just like screeching and all this stuff. But then like in the Indian context, like it was a very joyous occasion.
It is, yeah.
So it is like this kind of interesting to see how the perception of one event from these two different angles, can certainly color the sort of accepted view of what something represents.
Yeah, I read his description of the Jagannath Yatra, and I think it reminded me of I am from this temple town called Udupi, where we have a big Krishna temple, and Krishna Janmashtami over there. It's like a fight to get like in there, and you have fun. It's a festival. Everyone's having fun. Everyone's dressed to the nines, and but I can imagine if he was there at that moment, he would have probably written it probably the same way. I mean, our rats are not as big as the Jagannath rats. Those are juggernauts.
Yeah.
Literally. How do you think your project has evolved since you started it?
I mean, I think it's I don't really know if it's evolved that much, to be honest. Maybe that's to my discredit. But I think it's been pretty like I think I'm trying to I think I've been very clear from like the beginning that I don't like when I post, I don't really editorialize the clips. Like I just my kind of approach is like I just want to post the clips and I kind of want to let people see it, and they can kind of like do their own analysis. I try to just keep it kind of as straightforward and objective as possible. So I literally just like I take the clip and then I like post it on Twitter or Instagram, and then I like I just type out the caption. And I kind of just like put it out there, and then people are welcome to draw whatever conclusions they want. I mean, I certainly when I started, it was more of just like a like the Substack. I think has been a way in which it has evolved, and trying to kind of think of like more conceptual and more like deep dive on historical topics. Like there's all these interesting historical episodes that are just and historical characters that come up over and over again in the course of this research, who I feel like are just not like we just don't know that. Like there's so little work done on these figures, And so I think I've certainly, in addition to just doing the kind of daily work of finding clips and posting them, trying to kind of contextualize the material and try to put it in a try to contextualize it, not like. One of the points that Michael Altman makes in his introduction to his book that I think is really interesting and powerful was that, when Americans were talking about Hinduism in America, they weren't really talking about Hinduism, right? They were talking about themselves, or they were talking about religion in their own lives. And I think this is a very powerful kind of like perspective shift, because what it does is it like when you see these newspaper clips, behind all of these newspaper clips is like a whole historical and societal, cultural context that has to be fleshed out. Like what the things that were going on in America at the time impact how they would react to these representations, or how they would represent the Hindu, right? Like a great example is this clip. I think, again, I'm trying to remember the years. I think it was like 1874, maybe. There's a great clip. It's on Twitter. If you look up American Ganges on Hindoo History Twitter, you'll find it. But there's a great comic also in Harper's Magazine, and it's basically a picture of a river, and then this. If we can look it up later. I was going to say if I had a screen share, this would be perfect. But listen, don't worry about it. It's too much work. But basically, the comic it's a river that's labeled American Ganges. There's like a Vatican in the background, a crumbling public school, And then there's like these crocodile-like Catholic bishops crawling out of the river. And there's like a Protestant preacher with a Bible who's like protecting a flock of kids. I hope that's a vivid enough description, but like, it's a very interesting image because you see a conflation of these two issues, right? Like America had a long history of anti-Catholic prejudice. This was seen over and over again, whether it was against the Irish or against the Italians later. But this kind of even JFK, like people forget that even when JFK was running for president, like he had to fight against this accusation that he was loyal to the Vatican, right? Like he had to go on the campaign trail and say like, I'm not the Catholic candidate for president. So this like anti-clerical, anti-Catholic prejudice runs pretty deep in American culture. And in this comic strip, you see that anti-Catholic prejudice melding with the anti-Hindu prejudice, because the river is labeled American Ganges, and yet you have Catholic bishops crawling out of it. And the idea here is that like you have this sort of pre-existing, you have this, the anti-Hindu attitude kind of being transplanted on top of the anti-Catholic prejudice that already existed. The idea being that like both Catholics and Hindus are basically pagans or polytheists, and we have to protect American children from that pernicious influence.
Interesting.
So I think like elucidating that historical context is super important. And when looking at these clips and seeing the kind of rhetoric that comes out, I think that one thing I'm trying to do more of, and what I'm really interested in doing, and kind of where I see the future of the project is kind of this really is an American history, right? Like, and going deeper into that American history and understanding what were the sociological, religious, political, cultural developments that were occurring in the background that were animating or motivating these prejudices. One of the other points Altman makes in his book that's very interesting is that in a lot of ways, like in the 19th century, this is like when American identity was really forming, right? Like America as a nation, it was trying to formulate an identity for itself. And one of the points he makes is that the Hindu actually emerged as like the quintessential foil for the American identity. And in fact, like if you look at textbooks from that period, the textbooks discuss the Hindu a lot. The Hindus are covered extensively in the textbooks, and the way the Hindu is described is like they're the opposite of the American, right? Like the Hindu is like polytheist, pagan, hierarchical, and and whereas the American is like Protestant, democratic, egalitarian, and enlightened, right? So there's like it's very explicit in the way that the Hindu is used as a foil for the purposes of American identity formation.
I mean, that stands very counter to today's model minority story, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? Like in those days, yeah, like it was the Hindu was everything that the American was not supposed to be, and this was in school textbooks, right, at the time. There's a book I've excerpted it on the Twitter account. It's by a guy named Mitchell, and it's called Systems of Modern Geography. And it was actually this textbook was the most highly circulated textbook in American schools in the 19th century. So it was like the most popular geography textbook. And and it's very explicit about this mission of an American identity formation, and trying to is trying to ensure that American children we're as far from the Hindu as possible. So like this is the kind of like sociological and historical analysis that I think is very interesting, and I think that as members of the diaspora, like and people in America especially, like I think it's incumbent on us to kind of understand that history. And see that it will help us better understand our place in this country.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. The way you're phrasing it, it almost feels like while we tend to talk about immigration of especially Indians to the US in the last 50 years or so, or because of exclusionary immigration policies, but for the most part, it does seem as though they've been a part of here at least for the last 200 years. Like, if not very out there, at least in imaginations of people, right? Like,
for sure, yeah.
As you say.
Well, this is one of the challenges always, right? Is that the representation or the image was preceded the arrival of the actual people. So,
yeah.
like, if you look at like in the early, oh, perfect, look at that. Thank you for putting that up.
That is very visceral. Oh, they have them as crocodiles. Yeah, that's with the Pope hats. Yeah.
Yeah, so those are bishops, and they have these like crocodile like hats. and you have like
Yeah.
Protestant.
So that's their pope hats, right? Like those are those big
Yeah,
hats.
exactly.
I don't know what they're called. I think they're called mitres. Yeah, mitres.
Yeah, and then that's the Vatican in the background. Yeah, it's a great image, but
Yes.
yeah, I mean, so it's very interesting, right? Because like when Indian laborers did start arriving in America in the early 20th century, you see that like and then you have the kind of resistance to immigration starting to heat up. You see them deploy all of these stereotypes, to build up domestic opposition to the Hindu migrant coming to California in particular to be a laborer. One of the topics that I've been posting a lot of clips about lately were the Bellingham riots in Washington State. This occurred in 1907. So basically, Bellingham is I guess like a lumber town, lumber mill town in Washington, and there were a number of Indian Hindu. They were actually primarily Sikh, right? They were primarily Sikh, but at the time, like most of the newspaper reports, there were a few that distinguished, but a lot of them just called them Hindus. But they were basically working at these lumber mills, and the white laborers got upset that they were like these Hindu laborers are taking our jobs. So they essentially they had, I guess, housing for the migrant laborers near the lumber mill. So these white laborers basically went into this labor colony and just like violently expelled all of the Indian migrants. I don't think anyone was killed, but like a bunch of people were injured, and they basically made them they marched them to the Canadian border. Basically, some people fled to Los Angeles, some people went to Seattle, but all the migrants were kicked out. And like looking at the kind of newspaper clips around that event, you see that like all these kind of stereotypes come to the fore in order to justify the actions taken against them.
Yeah, interesting. That's another echo from the past that we see today, I guess.
Oh yeah, great.
There is heathen invasion.
Yeah, this is great cover of the Heathen Invasion, Mabel Potter Dackett. Yeah, American women losing fortunes and reason, seeking the eternal youth promised by the swarthy priests of the Far East.
I mean, a part of it wants to make you laugh, but then you talk about, like, as you say, there are these actual real life.
It is funny. You can laugh. It is a little bit funny.
It's absolutely hilarious. Yeah, I wonder how Mr. Mabel will feel about, again, Indians being coined as the model minority today, right? Like the kind of minority that every other minority should aspire to be, as according to some people. Which I think it's an interesting counterpoint on how histories really change, or in some cases not change at all. When you use like some actions to justify other negative actions, or stereotypes to justify negative actions. It's history, as they say, it doesn't often repeat, but it rhymes, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But actually, speaking on that context, how do you think the work that you're doing relates to the current situation, or relates to today? I mean, you talked about, for example, the COVID, during the COVID crisis, how the funeral pyres were like a direct callback to how funeral pyres were like observed and back in the day. But how else do you think Hindu history is important? Like, or rather, how do you view this project in the context of Indian identity or Hindu identity today in the US and Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that motivated me to do this in the first place, and I think one of the reasons why the newspaper is such a great medium is, like, I think like a lot of people, like I grew up here, but I would, read American media to kind of see what was happening in India. And I'm by no means an expert, but I like kind of know enough to know that like what I was reading wasn't telling the whole story. Yeah. Like I kind of even just knew like intuitively, like, okay, like there's something going on here that, we're not like, there's like a deliberate obfuscation of the whole story, and it's in a systemic way. And so I think in that way, like I think the work of Hindu history is valuable, because what I'm trying to show is that like these topics, like this has always been a very contested category, right? Like the image of the Hindu in America has always been a contested topic. Like it's always been kind of controversial, and understanding, the historical context and the kind of ways in which these different like like I talked earlier about these like three different streams, right? Like so one of the things that's interesting in Hindu history is seeing how these streams interact and how they change over time. Like for example, like to talk about the Juggernaut, one of the interesting things about this is that So yes, the Juggernaut was the dominant image of the Hindu for decades. And its success was kind of its undoing, because what happened was that it was such a vivid, such a gory description that you had all these other writers travel to India to go see it for themselves. And then what happened was that these other writers would go see the Jagannath Yatra, and they didn't see what Buchanan described. He didn't see people committing suicide. He didn't see like infants being thrown into the river. He saw they saw festivals, right? And they saw like this basically a chariot being dragged. And so what happened was that instead of sticking with this sort of like distorted Buchanan view, what they ended up doing is they ended up shifting their attention to Kali or Durga, right? And they said there's like a great article about like it was like ranking the scariest idols basically, and the whole premise of the article is like, actually the Juggernaut is a very kind idol. The real scary one is Kali, right? Kali is the one where people are like sacrificing humans to, or like doing all these like bloody pagan sacrifices and stuff like that. So like there is this sort of like these representations aren't fixed. Like they change over time, as new information comes in, as especially as Indians come in greater numbers, right? And then that also impacts a kind of like how this discourse shifts back and forth. So I think it's sort of like you can go and like read the New York Times, and you can just like every article you read, you can be like, well, I'm going to fact check this, and it's like, yeah, like I don't really know how effective that is. Like you can go fact check whatever you want. Also, I think the more interesting and more effective exercise is to understand like what are the underlying reasons why like these certain images or certain stereotypes still persist, right? And ultimately, like newspapers, they're appealing to a readership. They're appealing to people with certain attitudes. They're existing to confirm certain pre-existing attitudes people already have, right? Yeah. And these pre-existing attitudes exist at the cultural and the social level. And I think understanding like the kind of, like I said, like the social, historical, cultural background in the context of Hindu history can help us, I think, more effectively elucidate why like we see this media treatment today. So I think that's like the kind of grand project, is just to kind of get people to think more critically about the kind of the American side of things, right? Like what is going on in American history, in American society, and what can that teach us about what's going on, rather than just being like, the New York Times is not telling the truth about X, Y, Z. It's like, yeah, well, it's like, this is what they do. This is what media is, so yeah.
So almost understanding their context helps us place the news articles that are coming out today.
Understanding like the role that the Hindu has played in American society from late 18th century on, and understanding how this representation has changed over time, and understanding like how these same understanding how those same factors have exist today, maybe in different ways. I think that is a helpful exercise to help us contextualize what we see.
How do you think it has changed though? Because one of the things, do you see some way of how the success of the Hindu community, which has been fairly successful, especially in the recent years, having high economic potential and things like that, and very educated. How do you see the success represented in media today, and how do you think that relates to how Hindus were represented in the past?
I honestly don't really know the answer to that. I don't know if it's, I think it's generally something that's underappreciated. Like, I don't think that, I will say that on this topic, I think that it's not really connected to Hindu history per se, but I do think that, in thinking about like the Hindu community in America, I do think that sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that like we're like totally unique, and that like whatever issues that we're dealing with in American society, it's like no one else has ever had to deal with that. And I think one valuable lesson that you learn if you study American history is that this is, in a lot of ways like a recurring pattern, right, for all immigrant groups. And like I made you see the anti-Catholic prejudice and how that affected Italians and Irish. Like, yeah, I don't know if like the coverage of Hindu American success per se, what we can take from that, but I do think that we should understand that like any immigrant group that comes to this country and is upwardly mobile and successful, like there are going to be pushbacks against that. Like it's just the reality of our, the society that we live in, probably any society, And I think that understanding, like looking at, the Hindu history helps, specifically with our community. But I think studying American history more broadly and looking at the way other immigrant groups were treated and how they kind of found their place in American society is a very valuable exercise when it comes to understanding our own place and understanding, how we kind of make our place in American society.
Yep, that sounds, that makes sense. So this is again a slightly different question now. What advice would you give to, say, a young Hindu person today in the Americas or anywhere, who wants to get involved in a project like the one that you have? One that kind of helps them share the knowledge that they have gained with the wider audience, or just, who wants to get involved in more Hindu things on Twitter or anywhere else in social media. What advice would you give them on how to get started, how to find resources, and how to grow their audience?
I mean, there's like such a thirst for knowledge, or like the kind of, I mean, I'll say, like, broadly speaking, like, I don't think there's been any better time to do something like this than it is now. Like, just in terms of like the number of tools that are available to anyone who's interested in doing stuff like this. The audience is just there and like is so desperate for this stuff, like Hindu history. I mean, like, obviously my audience is primarily American. But it's like a lot of my followers are from India, and it's the fact that India is English speaking is very like it's great. I mean, if you're trying to build an audience on social media and you're interested in these kinds of issues, because you'll be able to get followers from both sides of the both sides. And I think that like if you are interested in doing something like this, the best thing you can do is just like you just have to start creating something, like just create an account. And if original historical research, like there's always an audience for it. Like there's a bunch of people out there that can just like give an opinion, like opinions are very cheap. And, I think it's pretty hard to build a following just doing, like just giving your opinion on various issues. But if you're able to produce some like original historical research, like you'll get an audience and people will be interested in it. And there's so much out there that hasn't been explored yet and that needs to be explored. So I do think it's a great time to kind of like pursue stuff like this. You just have to kind of have to start by doing it, and you'll see it grow from there.
Do you think working on this project has opened you to allegations of being Hindutva? That's an allegation that gets thrown around quite.
I get that allegation all the time. I think mostly because of my personal Twitter and not because of my not because of Hindu history. But I mean, you can't let that stuff bother you. Like I think one of the reasons why like this is such an underexplored area is because of that fear that people have of like not wanting to be put into this bucket. But the thing I think you have to understand is that like the sort of consensus, what I call like the consensus South Asian view in the diaspora is so like fringe, frankly, and so out of touch with the daily reality that like it is really stifling creative freedom and intellectual freedom. And so as long as you get over that like initial like, oh, I don't want people to think I'm X, Y, or Z, like there's very little competition. It's pretty great. Like you can just go out there and just be intellectually honest and try to produce original research and and don't like don't. I will say that like it's very easy to especially on Twitter like to be like polemic and just like kind of generate controversy for the sake of generating controversy, and you'll get a lot of followers doing that. But it's not satisfying and it's not going to lead to anything lasting, So I think that's the one, you fight the temptation just to like be polemic for its own sake and just focus on creating something original, like original research, and just be honest to your own experience. And I think that like there's a lot of opportunities out there.
I think that's great advice. We're going to jump to audience questions now, but before I start with the audience questions, I'm going to start with the questions from the members of our youth initiative. to remind the audience again, we do have a youth initiative focused on the younger people in North America, younger Hindus, and building a community around them. As towards the end of our meeting or session today, I'm going to share more information on how you can join the youth initiative. But for now, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions from members of our initiative. So one of them asked, Hinduism was always tolerated in some circles, right? Like, as you said, the philosophical circles were a little bit more open to Hinduism, especially the philosophical concepts of it. Do you think they saw a difference in like the term religion in an Abrahamic sense versus Hinduism and Hindu Dharma being a slightly different idea philosophically? Do you think that distinction was made, or did you see any evidence for that?
It's a really interesting and really good question. And the answer is, so, I mean, this goes to really the heart of the sort of understanding of religion at this time. So like, one of the important, I guess, points to understand here is that like the American understanding of religion was very much like a product of like the English Enlightenment. And when you look at the sort of so early scholars of comparative religion, Hannah Adams in particular, she was like, she wrote in, so she released this thing called the Compendium of Religion. It has a very long title. It's the shortened version. It's just called the Compendium. But she was a scholar of comparative religion. She released the first volume of this book in 1784. And, this was like basically her like research on all the different religions of the world. And to understand where she was coming from, you have to kind of understand the intellectual background here, which is that coming out of like the Reformation, right, when you had this sort of like rationalistic view of religion that emerged, you had this different conception of religion where, you had this sort of religion kind of became this like rationalistic pursuit. And like you almost had like a scientific method that was used to delineate like the truth between different Christian denominations, right? And from this understanding emerged this idea of like religion as a universal category. So people when they went to India, they saw like, oh, well, these people have some sort of notion of like a creator. They have some notion of like this, laws delivered from a divine being. So when they initially were describing Hinduism or their understanding of it, they really fit it into this pre-existing mold they had of Christian religion. So they would, for example, Hannah Adams talks about Brahma as like a Moses type lawgiver who delivers the Vedas to the priests. Like that's and their view was that like this original Vedic religion was monotheistic. It was like a primal monotheism. So like their idea was that the Indians initially had some idea of pure religion. So like all of this is premised on the understanding, their understanding that Protestant Christianity was like the pinnacle of religious thought, right? It was like the rational pinnacle of religious thought. Mm-hmm. So when they encountered Indians, they said like, okay, well, they clearly have some sort of spiritual or religious understanding, but then over time it degraded, and now it's turned into this like idolatrous, polytheistic, pagan mess. It was essentially their view. It's called the declension theory of religion.
Interesting.
And this was the kind of standard model for Hindu religion for American scholars of religion. And so even for the Vedantists, like the Thoreau and the Emerson, like they didn't look at Hinduism as like in a separate category. They basically looked at it as like it's I don't know if you've ever been to like the Vedanta Society before. San Francisco has the first one formed by Swami Vivekananda himself. You go into it and it's essentially church pews. It looks like a church. And then in the front there's like little statues of Vivekananda and Jesus and Ramakrishna and all the
Interesting.
But for them, like Vedanta was really like the reason it caught on with this kind of Unitarian elite is because they saw in Vedanta like an improvement on the kind of Unitarian Christianity that they were already following, right? Because this rational view of religion, like they, like interestingly, even if you look at like some of the writing of Emerson and Thoreau, one of the arguments they often make is like against the missionaries is like, you guys are hypocrites because Christianity has all this superstition too, right? Like we do all this stuff that, is not grounded in reason or rationality. And so what they used Vedanta for is to kind of like break away from that as well and kind of create this like pure, rationalistic, monotheistic religion. And so, yeah, it's a kind of a long, complicated story, but the basic idea is that they did not distinguish between like they didn't really they weren't that nuanced about this category of religion.
Interesting. That's very fascinating. It's all the idea that they took Vedanta and then tried to make their own religion better. That sort of back and forth is very fascinating.
Well, even Ram Mohan Roy, right? Like the great, reformer in Bengal, like even he, like, is often kind of criticized by people of basically being like a Unitarian or a Christian. But in his writings, he was quite critical of Christian missionaries too, right? And he said, like, well, you guys aren't, like, you're not, following these same rational principles, or in your own religion,
Yeah.
And so Vedanta was always held out as something like superior or better or more pure than those.
Yeah, I think I remember I did read a little bit of Unitarian philosophy at some point in my life, and I remember thinking that sounded a lot like Hindu philosophy to me. So I
Yeah.
see where that source comes from now. Another question we had from one of the youth initiative members was on how similar, or rather, what did you see as connections between the way Hindus were represented in the past year's newspaper reports versus how some other communities, I think specifically when you think of such as the Jewish communities, which also have these big diasporas and also have this accusation that, you have the caste for Hindus, you have the clannishness for the Jewish people. So how did you see that sort of relationship between the two?
Yeah, so this would also be a great Substack post, but and it's also kind of been in the public. This has been an issue of public interest recently because you have all these issues with universities, right? Like universities discriminating against Asian applicants. And so this history has kind of come back to the fore, which maybe some people were not aware of. But, in the early 20th century, when basically, universities implemented this standardized testing for entry. And what happened is that Jews started getting admission to Ivy League universities in very large numbers. Like, I think Columbia, it was like 40% Jewish or something. Like, and a lot of these Jews were like poor immigrants from like Eastern Europe, Russia, who were growing up in very like humble backgrounds, but were very studious, very smart, and then ended up getting great test scores, ended up getting into these colleges. And it led to kind of a crisis in these Ivy League colleges. And famously, the president of Harvard, I forgot his name, he called it the Jewish problem, quote unquote. And they tried to institute quotas to kind of reduce the Jewish admission ratios. The quotas themselves ended up getting struck down, but they basically created this new system where they wanted equal regional representation in America. And so it de facto accomplished the same thing. But if you look at the newspaper clips from that period, it's very interesting because a lot of the criticisms, a lot of the columns that you saw like about this problem were about exactly this. They would say that the Jews were clannish, they would not assimilate, they didn't understand like American culture, and that's why they had to kind of cut down on their admissions in these Ivy League universities. So, I mean, it's a little bit different because in the early 20th century, I mean, the Indian immigrants were not like, they were laborers, right? And so they weren't. It wasn't really the same in that sense. But you do see an underlying concern, which is the failure to assimilate, right? Mm-hmm. So the kind of the argument used against the Jews who got admission to Ivy League, or the argument in favor of instituting the quotas, was that they're clannish, they keep to themselves, they won't assimilate. And then the argument that was used against Indian laborers in the early 20th century was also that, like, oh yeah, they have their caste divisions and they won't assimilate into American society. They're not fit for American society. Like, they don't follow our culture or our habits or whatever. They won't eat with us, so you do see the kind of underlying concern of their unwillingness to assimilate in both cases, even though the social context is very different.
That is, that makes sense. Although I would love to read that Substack post once you do get to write it.
Yeah, eventually I'll get to it.
I think we can start looking at some audience questions too at this point. But while we're waiting for the audience questions, I would like to once again remind everyone that Vishal has a great Twitter feed called Hindoo History, and also his own Twitter feed, which is VJG Tweets. And he also has a Substack, and that Substack is?
HindooHistory.substack.com.
So please go ahead and register for his Substack. And let me see if there are any questions from the audience at this point. But while we're also waiting for the audience questions, I would also like to take this opportunity to talk about our youth initiative again. As I mentioned earlier when we started this conversation, the point of this youth initiative was to build a community for North American Hindu youth. So we're starting with college students and high school students, and especially since they tend to, if they face any questions regarding, if they have any questions regarding what Hinduism is, what the Dharma is, or if they want to turn to their peers and ask any questions, we want to build a safe space for the Hindu youth to actually have these conversations. And also, in case they face any kind of discriminatory events in their school or universities, and as that has happened to several students so far, we want to make sure that there's a space for them to, or someone for them to turn to and say, oh, I don't know what to do, my professor just said this to me. So for all of that, we want to build the space, and that's why we're building this youth initiative. But it's also a positive space. Yeah, there's the Twitter handle rather. It's also a positive space. We want to build a community where we can all talk to each other about all sorts of things Hindu, which you cannot really talk to everyone because not that everyone gets it, or not that everyone's interested, or maybe not everyone can answer those questions. So basically, the idea is to build a safe space for Hindu youth. If you guys do want to join, you can either join by going into the Kona website and filling out the Get Involved form and specifying that you want to get involved with the youth initiative. Or there are a couple of email IDs that we'll put in the comment section that you can reach out to. You can reach out to Agrima Agnihotri at Kona.org or Sakshi Sharma at Kona.org. We'll put the information in the comments, and you can reach out to them, and they can also help you get connected directly with the youth initiative. All right, so here is our question. What do you think about the future of Hindus in America?
So this is a complicated question, but it's a good question. But I hope I don't upset people with my answer. But I think that we really have to kind of negotiate this issue of what exactly is a community. Because I think we often take for granted that the Hindu community actually exists. And I'm not sure it does. I think that, this, often you see people complain about why can't, why aren't Hindus, despite our economic status in America, why aren't we more effective politically, right? But it kind of presupposes that there is a we to begin with, and I think this is really the underlying issue that people don't kind of think about enough. I think it's kind of taken for granted. And what I mean by this is the fact that we might share a spiritual, cultural, philosophical affinity, to me, that's one thing. But then the question of whether that translates into an actual political, if we're defining a community as a political community, like a community with shared political values, a shared political interest, the fact that translates into a kind of political community, I think is often taken for granted, and I don't think it's the case. And I think that one of the reasons why, Hindus are not effective in America politically is because we're not thinking foundationally enough, what are the elements of a political community? How do you actually, what does it mean to have shared values that you can go and actually lobby for, and shared interests that you can go lobby for? I think that there's a sort of, it's taken for granted because we often feel like we're under attack or we're treated unfairly. And that kind of leads to this natural indignation. And you have this indignation and you think oh, well, you also feel this indignation, so now we're part of a group. But it's one thing to have kind of shared indignation over unfair treatment, and it's totally another thing to say we have a shared vision of what our interests are and what we think that our kind of status in American society is, and we should go pool our resources and fight for that. And I just don't, I think there's a disconnect between those two that hasn't really been solved yet. And, I think there's a deeper issue too. So part of this is generational, maybe. I'm in my 30s. I was born and raised in America. And, I think that among my peers, most of my peers don't care about any of this stuff. They're just totally indifferent. They just are, they're just, they don't care, it's just not part of their everyday life, they might, in terms of they might love their culture, and they might do the festivals, and they love their parents. They'll go to temple when they, or go with their families or whatever. but they really don't have any sort of broader understanding, and I'm not faulting them for this. I don't think that there's a clear answer. I'm just saying that I don't think they have a broader understanding or idea of how that kind of cultural value translates into sort of any sort of political coalition or political understanding. And maybe it's not possible. Maybe that's just, maybe there isn't one, But so I think that, obviously things are different now because you have a whole new group of people who are immigrating, and they are from very different background, and they have a very different, maybe they have a different political understanding. And so maybe that'll be different. But yeah, I mean, coming from my perspective and thinking about, my generation, my cohort, I'm not sure there is a Hindu community. And I think that you have to accept it as a kind of a given that, regardless of what kind of your attitudes or your parents' attitudes, assimilation is kind of inevitable, it's going to happen, and so you have to kind of think about what the community means in the context of that trend, right? Where you are going to just gradually assimilate more into American society. So how do you, what does it mean to be Hindu in that context? Where to be Hindu, I mean, is such a as an identity, it's so closely tied with Indian cultural identity, right? It's very hard to separate those two. But if you accept it as inevitable that you're going to assimilate, your kids are going to be even more assimilated than you are, then all of a sudden that becomes less tenable in my mind, unless you're just trying to create some sort of secluded enclave where you don't you want to be like the Amish or something, and just create your own little cultural enclave that is kind of cut off from broader American mainstream society. But I don't think that's I think for most people that's just not that's not how they intend to live their lives. So I would encourage people to think a lot more critically about what that means to say that that when they use the term Hindu community in America, really think deeply about what you're implying and whether what you're implying is actually true to reality.
Yeah, I think you're right about community too. That's one of the reasons why we even just thought of doing this youth initiative. It's because we felt like there was an actual lack of a Hindu community, right? Yes, there are Indian communities with more secular sense, in a secular sense, but there's no community for Hindus as such. So I think this question, there are a lot of questions around along these lines, which is, has your research shown that there's very little change over the years as to where the source of the Hinduphobia really is?
I don't know if my research has touched on this specifically. I think that there are certainly certain attitudes that come out in the newspaper clips I posted on that I feel are pretty familiar to us today. And for me, I just think that that's again, like I said, these attitudes, they don't just disappear overnight, right? These attitudes were shaped over decades, and it's to fix them and to correct them is also going to take a long time. And so I think it's helpful to identify the historical continuity of certain attitudes and to understand that look, these attitudes were pervasive in America. They were the product of very specific cultural, political, and religious forces in American society over decades. And you can't just expect those to kind of disappear overnight. You have to understand them, and then you have to confront them. And you have to kind of and you can only really confront them effectively if you understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think you kind of asked, I've asked this question earlier too, which is, have you faced any kind of attacks from charges along the lines of being a Hindu or attacks from Hindu folks?
Not Hindu history, but again, I mean, on my personal account, I get that all the time.
Oh, actually, do you think Hindu history has not been targeted as to Hindutva?
No, not at all. I mean, that's the beauty of historical research, right? I mean, I'm literally just throwing up newspaper clips, and it's it's very difficult to just see the research and see the material right in front of your eyes and be like, this is biased. It's no, it's I'm just showing you what's in the newspapers, So that's I do think that I do think that it's important. I guess related to the question you were asking earlier about people who were interested in creating similar stuff is I do think that you do have to operate in the intellectual environment as it is, which I mean to say people will try to put you in a bucket very quickly. And the minute they put you in a bucket, they'll just ignore you or they'll dismiss you. And so, that's kind of why I tread lightly. Like I don't editorialize because, I want to reach a wide audience. Like I want this to be of general interest to people. And I think it should be of general interest, like I'm not trying to like sneak something past you. I'm just like, look, like this is our history, as a diaspora. Like these newspapers were prolific, this content was prolific throughout the country. And it's important to understand like this background, like, so yeah, I mean, that's I feel like that's, the benefit of doing the historical research and trying to keep it as objective and trying to, focus on, doing the research. Like if you do good work, people can't ignore it,
All right. Yep. I think that about should be the end of our session today. Thank you very much, Vishal. This was a very fascinating conversation. And I think my conversation here has shown me a lot about not just some of the representations of Hindus in the past or Hindus in the past, but also how to start a project like this and how to build an audience without, getting derailed by absurd allegations. I think that's an important way to think about how do we build a story for Hindus and Hindu community as we go ahead in the next few years. All right.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, namaste. Sorry, thank you everyone for being here. As I said, if you do want to join the youth initiative, I think I didn't mention the age because I keep saying youth, but while we are currently focused on high school and college student-related issues, we're actually looking for anyone from teens to early 30s, anyone in that age range who wants to join, and early 30s can be defined quite loosely. So, take that to mean as you will. We have included a link in the chat for how you can join or get involved with the link to sign up has been provided by Priya Singh. So please do get involved and do join us and be a part of this community so that we can build a new community, as Vishal said, and redefine what Hindu community means in the US and hopefully change any further stereotypes. All right. Namaste, everyone. Thank you for being here. Shubh Ratri.